Good morning, everyone. I hope you've been enjoying the conference so far. My name is Emily Speer, and as you just said, I'm from Fort Lewis College down in Durango, and I'm a biology student. This past summer, I was fortunate enough to do some undergraduate research in a particular area of interest of mine, which is, of course, riparian ecology. And what I was looking for were any patterns or correlations between the changes that have been occurring with the vegetation along the river and the sediment storage. So just a little background information. Should I just hold this? Yeah. Okay, sorry. So just a little bit of background information and to let you know where my study, oops, that's the wrong button. Thanks. Okay, I was going to try to use the laser pointer, but I don't know what button that is, so the middle one? Thank you. That one. Okay, so up here we have the Four Corners area, of course, and down here in southeastern Utah is where the San Juan River is located, and just blown up a little bit for the particular region that I've focused on. This is the lower half of the San Juan River, and if we have any river rats in the crowd, you might be a little bit familiar with the put in here, which is Mexican hat, and then the common takeout up here is Clay Hills. And then just the triangles in blue represent each of my individual study sites along the river. And so as we all know, riparian environments are those that are the interface between land and water. And they're really great to serve for environmental indicators as they are so sensitive to the change that has been occurring around them. And it's actually really sad because ever since the latter half of the 20th century, when human activities such as dam construction became really prominent, we've lost or at least altered 70 to 90% of all the environments that once were natural in the United States. And that's huge. And then as I was doing my research, I found many studies that focused on areas downstream of dams, which makes a lot of sense because it's as if you're turning off the faucet and now the whole area downstream of the dam is completely deprived of their normal amounts of water that they're used to get. It was also interesting, it was a little bit more difficult to find studies that have been taking place upstream of dams, as these changes are a lot more gradual. And a lot of the times it takes about 50 years or so for riparian environments to reach a new kind of normal once a great change has occurred around them. And in the area that I'm studying, there's actually 2 dams that are affecting my study sites. And the first one is a ways upstream, located in New Mexico, and it's the Navajo Dam. And then there's also Glen Canyon Dam, which is placed on the Colorado River, but it's actually kind of relatively close to the confluence of the San Juan and the Colorado. And we're seeing a lot of effects, particularly with the sediment storage from the Glen Canyon Dam. And with my study, I decided to focus on Salix exigua, which is a type of a willow. And it's an early successional species within riparian environments. And Salix exigua actually relies heavily on the natural flow regime of the river. For example, the Salix needs the annual floods of the river for seed dispersal, and it also relies on those floods to scour up the banks to produce bare and moist soil for seed germination to take place and therefore vegetative reproduction to occur. So some of the questions that I had going into this study was, I wanted to know if there was any correlation between sediment storage and the changes in vegetation that we see occurring on the river. And I also wanted to know if there was a story that could be told through the lens of vegetation if we just looked at that specifically and looked at the plant community types that were present. And then furthermore, I wanted to know if the dams played a large role in this story, or if there was a way to prove that these dams played a role in the story. And ultimately, the goal of this study was to hopefully find a way to improve river management that would benefit the overall health of the river system. And so just to give you an idea of some of the changes that have been occurring over the past years, this photo here on the left was taken on the Miser survey that went down in 1921, which was one of the first surveys that happened on the San Juan River. And what I want you to notice here is just on the banks of the river, we can see there's not much vegetation that can be seen. Although it's black and white, you can still pick out what's vegetation and what's rocks. And then when we compare this photo to a photo that my colleagues and I took just this past summer when we went down the river, you can see that these banks are completely armored with vegetation. And for those of you who may be familiar with this area, these photos were taken at Slickhorn Canyon. And so that's a huge amount of change vegetative-wise in about 91 years or so. Also, if we look at it through the lens of sediment accumulation just by itself, we can see this photo here is taken in June 1961. And just down here is where you can see where the river is, and we have our rafts here. And if we focus on these people who are just kind of hanging out in the shade, if we go about 25 to 30 feet above them and see this boulder right here and follow the arrow across, that's the very same boulder that was taken in this photo when we went down the river just this past summer. So that's huge. That's about 25 to 30 feet of sediment accumulation just in 51 years alone. And this study is actually driven by the fear that many people believe that the San Juan River might not actually be runnable within the near future, potentially the next 20 to 50 years, because of the changes that are occurring along the river. So after seeing that, yes, okay, there is a lot of change going on with the vegetation, and yeah, we can see that there's a lot of change going on with the sediment dynamics. I wanted to see if there was a correlation between the two. And I wanted to observe the plant community types that were present on each of the point bars specifically along the river. And forgive me for this issue there, but anyways. So the reason why I wanted to look at the point bars specifically was because what I did for this study, it's a baseline data study. It's never been done before, and if the study were to be continued in the future, I wanted my studies to be easily replicated, and I wanted there to be some sort of consistency within where the study sites are and what data is being collected. So what did I do before I went down the river and when I was on the river? First of all, I used a stratified random sampling technique, and I divided up the 50 river mile stretch from Mexican Hat down to Clay Hills, and I used, I divided the 50 river miles into 5 10-mile sections, and then within each section, I divided the 10 miles up and randomly selected 4 sites within each section. And then once I was on the river, the very first thing I did at each site was to find bank full, which is just the normal flow level of the river system itself, as I did go down during the drought system, so the river was a little bit lower than it usually is. I also used the point intercept method just to record a general, a general basis of what vegetation were present as far as plant community types are. And I also received a permit to cut down some vegetation that was there to kind of get an age approximation of the willows and tamarisks that were present along each site, just to see if that played any role in it as well. Environmental variables that I focused on were things such as channel width, aspect, and river gradient. And I wanted to see if any of these correlated with the changes that we could observe along the river as well. And then once all of my data was collected, I used the PC ordination program using the non-metric multidimensional scaling ordination, also known as NMS or NMDS. And I used that to look at all of my data. And why NMS is such a great program to use is that it allows you to look at multiple variables all at the same time and see how they correlate with one another, which is really great. And so my study sites here are located or indicated with triangles, and I did go ahead and divide these up into 2 categories, as my greatest discovery was that channel width actually plays a huge role within the species composition that we find along the river. And so the category 1 in red represents study sites that have a channel width that's wider than 35 meters, while the category 2 in green is representing my study sites that had a channel width that was narrower than 35 meters. So also these, the blue dots up here with the abbreviations for the different species that I observed at all the study sites, these represent the centroids of the species of abundance and where they sit relative to the study sites. And then, as I said, the greatest discovery that I had was that channel width plays a huge role in the species plant community types that were present. So, for example, what this graph is telling us is that as channel width is increasing in this direction, we can expect to find more tamarisk, more of the rush family, and more baccharis, also known as steep willow. And the biggest thing that sticks out is that willows do in fact favor areas with a much narrower channel width. Something else that I found that was really easy to see, or easier to see the further downstream we moved, was that tamarisk age was also kind of correlated with the channel width, and that as the channel width got wider, the age of the tamarisk got significantly older. I also found that as the channel width got wider, the percent litter cover increased as well, and litter is just the dead plant debris that's found along the ground. And then we can also use NMS to look at specific species or specific categories. And this is just the channel width graph. Now we're looking at channel width. And all this is showing us is that along axis 1, as we're moving in this direction, the channel width is much wider, while over closer to axis 2, the channel width is much more narrow. Similarly, if we look at Salix exigua, or the willows, all by themselves, it's very clear that they do in fact favor narrow channel width. And just a reminder that category 1 in red are wide river channels, and the category 2 in green are narrow river channels. Something that was particularly interesting was this baccharis, this steep willow, which I wasn't really expecting to find. You never really know what you're going to do when you're going out and collecting data. Baccharis actually had a complete opposite trend as when compared to the willows, which was really interesting. And at first I was just kind of wondering if they might be competing for whether it's sunlight or some other nutrients variable. But what it came down to ultimately was, I think that the baccharis is dominating these areas with a wide channel width due to how willows actually germinate, going back to they need that bare, moist soil to germinate and take root. So just to give you a visual of the two different study sites that were really common, up here in the top left, we have my site number 9, which is around river mile 60. And this site was completely dominated with the baccharis, and it has a very wide channel width at 53 meters, while in this photo down below it was just 3 miles down the river, and the channel width decreased dramatically down to 18.5 meters, and it's just completely dominated by willows on either side of the riverbank. And just a reminder to let you know where we are along the river. Here's Mexican Hat at the put-in. Site number 9 at river mile 60 is right here, and site 10 at 63, just a little bit down the river. So, with all this study, what did I actually find? As I previously mentioned, channel width is the biggest story that I was able to prove and observe throughout my data. But I also believe that channel width is highly influenced by the changes in the slope of the river itself. And if you just think about, excuse me, as the slope of the river decreases, you're going to have a much wider flow. You can expect the river channel to get wider. And then also the percent litter ground cover, it was more commonly found with wider channel widths. And as far as vegetation goes, if we look through that lens, we found specifically that Salix exigua is more common in areas with a narrow channel width. The baccharis and tamarisk also favor areas with a wide channel width, just getting back to the fact that Salix exigua dominates in areas with a narrow river channel. And it was also interesting to see that with the exception of the rush family, most herbaceous plants favor areas with a wide river channel, which makes sense as you would expect that that area might not get flooded as much with the dams on them. So what this study provided was just a little bit of insight into which factors might be impacted by sediment accumulation. And we're able to find that channel width does play a huge role in the species composition. And with the help of repeat photography, we're able to look back through history and actually track the changes that have been occurred, as these are gradual changes and they're not that easy to observe on a day-to-day basis. And so just to wrap up my study and the big take-home message from what I was able to find with this baseline data collection is that with sediment accumulation, or the changes in the sediment accumulation will greatly impact the changes in river gradient, and it's the changes in the river gradient that we're expecting will alter the channel width, and it's the changes in the channel width that are ultimately driving the changes that we can see in the riparian vegetation. And so, in conclusion, I really hope that this study will be able to continue over the years and hopefully turn into a long-term study site, and with the hopes that if we can understand more with the sediment transport dynamics along the river, then we'll be able to ultimately learn more about the vegetative patterns with the hopes of becoming even better river managers. And thank you so much for sitting and listening to my talk.
We have time for a few questions. Any questions?